Hello, and thank you for joining me. This evening, I'm going to be discussing the Bible and Christianity. Is it a sin for a Christian to study or know astrology? Okay, the first thing that we have to establish is the Old Testament condemns astrologers and sorcerers and so on. I believe that's found somewhere in the book of Isaiah. I would have to look it up. Maybe someone could help me here with that. But I don't have the benefit of being able to look it up right now, but I believe it's in Isaiah. Anyway, the New Testament and the Old Testament, I think we can agree, contradict themselves. And of course, the Bible tells us God is not the author of confusion, okay? And so we're not supposed to be confused. What we have to do is discern, as a Christian, do I follow the Old Testament or do I follow the New Testament? Okay, so here in the book of James 2:10, this is discussed in Scripture. For whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend at one point, he is guilty of all. So it's saying if you break one law in the Pentateuch or the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, if you break anything in there, you've broken all of them, okay? Now that's a problem for Old Testament Christians. That's a problem for Christians who appeal to the Old Testament for commandments to follow. And I'll get into why. So Deuteronomy, which is one of the 5 books of Moses, part of the Pentateuch, part of the Torah, the Old Testament, it talks about what the old law prescribed or commanded in the instance of a woman being raped. Okay? I'm going to look at several translations here. Deuteronomy 22, 28, and 29. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her, let's go through what seizes means. If the government comes and seizes your property, they're taking it against your will. You're not agreeing to it. They're taking it. Okay? So this is just another way of saying he rapes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all his days. Okay, so she's not betrothed, which means she's not engaged or married or anything like that. And he seizes her, takes her against her will. According to the old law, the rapist has to pay the father 50 shekels of silver, which is probably about $600 of today's money. I haven't done the conversion in a long time. I'm trying to remember how much 60 shekels of silver would convert to. If anybody here can help me out, I'd appreciate it, because that would just be nifty for me to know. Okay, so the old law says the rapist has to pay the father 50 shekels, and then the raped person has to marry her rapist, and he can't divorce her. Now, this is probably because there was no birth control hardly to speak of back then. And so if she became pregnant during this attack, it would allow her and her child to be taken care of. That's probably the reason for this. Really don't know for sure. But anyway, how many of today's Christians would say, okay, you raped my daughter, you owe me $600, you're going to have to marry her, and then the daughter, she can't go on with her life and marry somebody she actually loves. She has to marry her rapist, and all of that. And so how many Christians here are going to line up to obey that part of the old law? Yeah, I'm waiting. None of you. The reason for that is Christians are not supposed to follow the old law anymore. Okay? The Old Testament has a lot of old law in it, things that don't apply to Christians today. Now, am I saying that the Old Testament is useless and shouldn't be studied and should just be discarded like garbage? Absolutely not. And here's why. Romans 15:4 tells us why we have the Old Testament. For whatsoever things were written aforetime, which means were written before, were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. So these were people that were waiting for the coming of Christ. Okay, these things were written for those people so that they would know what signs to look for and how to recognize the Messiah so that they might have hope. So it also says it was written for our learning. Now, we can learn about the nature of God. We can learn the creation story. We can learn a lot from the Old Testament. Okay? But it is not our law. It is not our source of commandments. For the exception of, in the New Testament, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he makes a statement. He says, you know the commandments. He's referring to the 10 Commandments. So, from that, I glean that the 10 Commandments are still very much in effect. So now, I want to look at Isaiah 47:13. And here it says, let now the astrologers, those who prophesy by the stars, those who predict by the new moons, stand up and save you from what will come upon you. So here, Scripture is saying there are going to be astrologers, and they will be able to give you information about events that are to come. But evil rulers who oppose God can't benefit from the information. Okay? So God is sort of, I don't know if taunting is the right word, but he's basically saying that there'll be people that can come and give you information, but if you're going to oppose God, it really won't help you at all. The Bible speaks of the zodiac in several places. I believe Job chapter 9 verse 9 outlines this. He is the maker of the bear and Orion. The Pleiades, sorry, I can't pronounce that, and the constellations of the south. So the Bible here is speaking of constellations, and it's saying that God is the one that made them. A lot of the books of prophecy refer to the zodiac and the imagery of the zodiac, like the water bearer, which is associated with Aquarius, the bull, which is associated with Taurus, the lion, which is associated with Leo. Also, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, it's my understanding that a horoscope drawing was found within the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't know if it was wrapped up in the scrolls or beside the scrolls, but within that collection of works, a horoscope was found. And so the Bible may have been the basis for people actually drawing horoscopes. So here's where I think people get it twisted. Just because a person studies astrology or knows astrology doesn't mean that they're worshiping what would be considered minor divinities or gods with a lowercase g, like archetypes from Greek astrology that might be associated with some of the stars and planets. What I meant to say was archetypes from Greek mythology that are associated with stars and planets. There are other mythologies. Greek is just one that I'm using for an example. Okay, so Deuteronomy 17, 2 through 7, which is part of the Law of Moses, the 5 books, the first 5 books, the Law, the Torah. A Jewish person isn't supposed to worship any other gods. Okay? So the moon, the stars, the sun, things like that are not to be worshipped. Okay? And so astrologers are not worshiping any of the celestial bodies that God has put into place. They are studying the associations that are made with those celestial bodies, or concerning those celestial bodies. That's a big difference. To study something and to worship something are two different things. Let's take a look at Luke 21:25. Okay, of course that's the New Testament. That's addressing Christians. Okay, it says there will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. So the Bible is telling us that signs can be found in the universe, in God's creation. Also, when the wise men, also known as the Magi, were looking for Jesus' house, because the wise men didn't go to the manger scene, they found Jesus as a toddler living in a house with Mary and Joseph. Anyway, Matthew 2:1-12, okay, describes how they followed star signs, or they were looking for a particular astrological alignment to follow in order to find Jesus. Now in Jeremiah 10:2, okay, Jeremiah was a prophet, of course, and he's saying that the stars are going to give information about the future, and he's telling people that they shouldn't be afraid of it. Also, even to this day, you will find rabbis discussing astrology. I'll put a link below. There'll be several links below. It was sort of an assumption, I guess you would say, because astrological references are made in the Bible, that Jews and Christians alike would know something about astrology and astronomy. Okay? Here we have, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. And that is found in Psalm 19:1-2. So again, the Bible is written in a language that people can relate to and understand, from the past, the present, and the future. And these references are being made to happenings from the universe that God created, with the assumption that Christians and Jews would have some understanding of it. There are also astrological references in Daniel 2:10, that's chapter 2 and verse 10, and chapter 1 and verse 20, where it speaks of knowledge and understanding. Also, Jesus is referred to as the rising sun. Okay, and in Ezekiel 47:1, okay, this is the direction that the temple is supposed to face, east. Okay, and even to this day, churches face east, graves face east, and so this comes from sort of astrological basis. Again, we have an example from the Old Testament, the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, the Torah. Okay, from Deuteronomy 22:9-11. It commands, do not plant 2 kinds of seed in your vineyard. If you do, not only the crops you plant, but also the fruit of the vineyard will be defiled. When's the last time anybody gave any thought to that sort of thing when planting crops? I understand that some people use the Farmer's Almanac and whatever, which, by the way, contains astrology and astrological references. But It wouldn't be considered defiled. You wouldn't be breaking any laws if you did it. It might not be good for the plants. Okay? Do not plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together. Okay? Do not wear clothes of wool and linen woven together. There's a reason for that. Wool and linen woven together was reserved for the garments of the priest. Okay, so people that weren't priests were not supposed to wear that combination of fabric. Jews even today have a special microscope that they can use to examine garments and fabrics to make sure that wool and linen are not woven together. And if they are, they wouldn't wear them unless they are part of the priesthood. Okay? So that's part of the old law. When is the last time you got a microscope out, Christians, and looked at your fabrics to see if you had a garment with wool and linen woven together? Or when's the last time you wore a wool slacks with a linen scarf or whatever? Okay, and were concerned about it, that you were sinning. Okay, so like I said again, Old Testament is not the text for a Christian. The New Testament is our text. Here we go again. Leviticus. Okay? All right, a tithe, the 10%, in other words, of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. Okay, so this is talking about the people of God giving 10%, giving a tithe of what they have. And this is another place where the Old and New Testament contradict each other, because the New Testament doesn't teach tithing. Much to everyone's surprise, it doesn't teach tithing at all. So the New Testament, okay, outlines a standard of giving that is in contrast, contrary to, in contradiction with the Old Testament. Okay, upon the first day of the week, which we understand to be Sunday, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. So on the first day of the week, which is Sunday, most people understand it to be Sunday, you are to give as you've been prospered. That's not a percentage. That's not what the Old Testament says. So Christians, what do we follow? The Old Testament or the New Testament? The New Testament, of course. Also, again, referring back to the Old Testament, Deuteronomy, if you allow your daughter, if she is raped by someone, to go and marry someone she loves instead of her rapist, you've broken the old law. Okay? And what does James 2:10 say? If you've broken one part of it, you've broken all of it. Okay? So, there again, another reason why the Old Testament is not our text. Not for commandment keeping, not for law, not for what we are to obey. It's the New Testament that we're supposed to follow. So basically, you would be sinning, okay, with regards to the old law in Deuteronomy if you allowed your daughter to marry someone other than her rapist. That's basically what I'm trying to say. So I'm going to recommend some reading material and things in the links below. There's a book called The Bible Doesn't Say That. It doesn't address astrology specifically, but it addresses some things that have been translated into the English version, like the King James and whatnot, that are not actually in the original Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic texts of what we are reading today. And it's called The Bible Doesn't Say That. I will put links in the description box below, of course. I'm also going to put some links because a lot of where we get all of this condemnation for astrology comes from the King James Version. There are some other versions, but the King James Version has a lot of errors in it. And I'm going to put some links below that will show you where those errors are. I'm not saying it's a bad version and don't use it. I'm just saying be aware that it's actually one of the versions that has the most errors. not the least errors. And so I'll put some information there below also. Thing to keep in mind about scripture, about witchcraft and whatnot, and the King James is he was very paranoid about witches. He had sort of a Halloween vision of what a witch was, and he thought that there were people that had supernatural powers that could curse him. Like when he was on a ship making a voyage, he thought that witches were blowing on the ocean to try to capsize the ship he was on. And I think we all know that's impossible and ridiculous, but I'll put some links for that also to consider for study. So I'm not really beating up on King James or anything. I'm just saying that he commissioned some scribes to translate the Bible into English, and you know, I think some things got mistranslated along the way during that process that kind of went along with what he already believed. And so I believe there's proof of that out there, so I'll put some links about that below also. Like I said, I'm not saying don't read the King James. It is written in a beautiful way, a beautiful language, but he says that version says some things that the Bible doesn't actually say. And one of them is, for God so loved the world. That's actually not in the old texts. That's kind of a liberty that was taken by the scribes who were translating it. Now, I'm not saying God doesn't love the world. Of course he does. Okay? But I'm saying word for word, verbatim, the Bible doesn't say that. Okay? So anyway, I appreciate you listening, and if you have any questions or comments, let me know. I really appreciate those who took the time out of their day to give me an ear. And I hope you have a great day. Like I said, questions and comments below, I would appreciate it. Signing off. Bye-bye.